August 26, 1346. A French knight named Jean de Hainaut looks down from a ridge at the field near the village of Crécy and sees something he doesn't quite know how to process. The English army below has brought cannons. Actual cannons, dragged across half of France, sitting in the mud next to the longbowmen. He probably laughed. Everyone laughed at cannons in 1346. They misfired constantly, sometimes killed their own crews, and took so long to reload that a cavalry charge would be over before the smoke cleared. Everyone knew how battles worked. Knights charge, infantry scatters, the side with better horses wins. It had worked that way for 1,000 years. The French cavalry charged 16 times. 16 times they were stopped. By nightfall, 1,500 French knights and 10,000 soldiers lay dead on the field. English losses were a few hundred men. King John of Bohemia, an ally of the French, was completely blind but demanded to be tied to his horse and thrown into the fighting anyway. They found him dead the next morning, still lashed to his saddle, his knights' horses tied to his by their reins. They had all charged together into the slaughter. He died beautifully. He died pointlessly. He died like a knight. Crécy wasn't just a battle. It was the beginning of the end for an entire civilization, a world where an armored man on a horse was the absolute master of every battlefield, where war was the exclusive business of the aristocracy, where your position in society was determined by whether you could afford 500 pounds of iron and a destrier to carry it. Gunpowder ended that world. Not all at once, not cleanly, but completely. This is the story of how a Chinese alchemist's accident became Europe's social revolution, how a powder invented for fireworks turned into the weapon that made feudalism economically impossible, and how the knight, that perfect, terrifying, enormously expensive symbol of medieval power, went from the most feared thing on any battlefield to an expensive anachronism that any peasant with a cheap gun could kill. Chinese alchemists discovered gunpowder sometime in the 9th century, and they discovered it the worst possible way. By accident, while searching for the elixir of immortality. The recipe they were experimenting with combined sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. One of them mixed the wrong proportions, applied heat, and the resulting explosion presumably ended his interest in the immortality project permanently. Tang Dynasty texts from around 850 AD contain the first written warning about the mixture, specifically cautioning alchemists not to combine these three substances near an open flame. The fact that someone felt the need to write that warning tells you everything about how the discovery was made. The Chinese military immediately recognized what they had. Within a century, Song Dynasty armies were using gunpowder in combat, fire arrows packed with powder mixtures, bombs thrown by catapult, primitive flamethrowers that sprayed burning powder at enemy formations. By the 10th century, Chinese engineers had developed the fire lance, a bamboo tube packed with gunpowder that projected flames and debris at close range. It was the direct ancestor of every firearm ever built, and it appeared in China roughly 400 years before Europeans had any idea gunpowder existed. The Chinese also understood gunpowder's limits. They used it extensively in warfare, but never developed it into the kind of battlefield-dominating technology that Europe eventually would. Part of the reason was tactical. Chinese warfare in the Song and subsequent dynasties involved enormous armies, complex siege operations, and naval combat where fire weapons were devastating. The specific combination of heavily armored cavalry dominance and stone castle warfare that made European gunpowder development so explosive, literally and socially, didn't exist in the same form. China invented the technology. Europe figured out how to use it to tear apart a social order. The Mongols were the transmission belt. When Genghis Khan's armies swept across Asia in the 13th century, they conquered China and absorbed Chinese military technology wholesale. Mongol armies carried gunpowder weapons into the Middle East and Eastern Europe. They used them at the siege of Baghdad in 1258. They brought them into Poland and Hungary. And wherever they went, they left behind the knowledge that such weapons existed, even if the precise recipes traveled more slowly than the armies. By the mid-13th century, European scholars were piecing things together. Roger Bacon, an English friar and natural philosopher, described a substance that could produce a flash of lightning and a thunderclap in a manuscript written around 1267. He encrypted the recipe in an anagram, apparently worried about what people might do with the information. He was right to worry. Within a generation, European armies were casting primitive cannons and trying to figure out how much powder was too much powder, a question that killed a significant number of early gunners before anyone arrived at satisfactory answers. By 1326, Florence's city records contained the first unambiguous European reference to a cannon, described as a metal vessel that fired iron balls. 2 years later, an illuminated manuscript shows an early cannon shaped like a vase firing a bolt into a castle gate. The image looks almost comical by later standards, but the arms race had started, and nobody understood yet what they had unleashed. The early cannons were terrible weapons by any later standard. They were made from iron staves bound with hoops, like wooden barrels constructed for explosions, and they failed with disturbing regularity. Loading took several minutes under ideal conditions. Accuracy was nearly non-existent beyond very short ranges. The cannons at Crécy in 1346 may have fired a few rounds and then fallen silent. Historians still debate exactly what role they played in that battle. What mattered at Crécy wasn't the cannons. It was the English longbow, which could put 12 arrows per minute into a charging knight at 200 yards. The cannon was a footnote, for now. But engineers kept working. And the thing about gunpowder technology is that it improves fast once people understand the basic principle. Better casting techniques produced stronger bronze barrels that could handle bigger charges without shattering. Better powder formulations, particularly the development of corn powder in the early 15th century, produced more consistent and more powerful explosions. Corned powder involved mixing the ingredients wet, pressing them into cakes, and then breaking the cakes into granules. The granules burned faster and more uniformly than the old loose powder, dramatically increasing the force of each shot. Better carriage designs made the weapons mobile enough to aim and position. Within a century of Crécy, the cannon had gone from an expensive curiosity to the most important weapon in Europe. The siege was where everything changed first. Medieval warfare was dominated by castles. A properly supplied castle with thick walls and a determined garrison could hold out for months or years against any army that lacked some way to breach the walls. The tactical logic of the entire feudal system was built around this reality. Knights were expensive to train and equip, but castles were the ultimate military investment. A lord who controlled a strong castle controlled the surrounding territory almost regardless of what happened in open battle. Sieges were about starvation and patience, not about breaking stone. Gunpowder ended that calculation in a single generation. A cannon firing a heavy stone ball repeatedly at the same point in a castle wall could breach it in days. The walls that had taken decades to build and had protected their owners for centuries became liabilities overnight. Thick masonry absorbed cannon fire badly, cracking and crumbling under repeated impacts in ways it never had against conventional siege equipment. The trebuchet could damage walls. The cannon could destroy them. Castle after castle fell to artillery in the 15th century that would have sat out any siege from 100 years earlier without serious concern. The response was to build new fortifications. The Tres Italiennes, the angular low-profile star forts that spread across Europe from the mid-15th century onward, were specifically designed to absorb and deflect cannon fire. The thick earthen ramparts and angular bastions eliminated the blind spots that had made medieval walls vulnerable. They worked reasonably well, but they cost 10 times what a medieval castle had cost, required professional military engineers to design, needed permanent garrisons of trained gunners to defend effectively, and demanded ongoing investment in artillery to remain competitive with whatever an enemy might bring. The economics of defense had shifted completely. Only wealthy, centralized states could afford the new military infrastructure. Individual lords could not. The financial foundation of feudalism was developing serious cracks. The French crown understood this earlier than most. Charles VII of France, fighting to expel the English during the final phases of the Hundred Years' War, invested heavily in artillery. His master gunners, Jean and Gaspard Bureau, developed mobile field artillery that could keep up with a moving army and deploy quickly on a battlefield. At the Battle of Castillon in 1453, a French artillery park destroyed a charging English force in minutes. It was the last major battle of the Hundred Years' War, and one of the first battles in European history decided primarily by gunfire. The English commander, John Talbot, was killed when his horse was brought down by a cannon shot. He was 70 years old, one of the last great commanders of the chivalric age, and he died from exactly the kind of weapon he had spent his career dismissing as secondary. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 repeated Crécy's lesson with brutal clarity. Henry V of England crossed into France with a small, exhausted army that had been marching for weeks. French forces intercepted him near the village of Agincourt with a force several times larger, heavy with armored knights who had every rational reason to expect an easy victory. The French cavalry charged across a muddy field channeled by woods on both sides, compressed into a mass that couldn't maneuver, and rode into a storm of English arrows. The knights' horses panicked and threw their riders. Knights in full-plate armor fell into the mud and discovered that full-plate armor, the most expensive military equipment in the world, made it nearly impossible to get back up without help. English infantry walked through the field, killing them with knives and hatchets. Approximately 6,000 French soldiers died. English losses were perhaps 400. The French nobility spent the next 20 years trying to explain why their most expensive, most elite, most heavily armored warriors kept getting slaughtered by English commoners with sticks and string. They never found a satisfying answer, because there wasn't one. The longbow had the same democratizing effect that the gun would later perfect at scale. It put lethal range power in the hands of men who had trained since childhood, but were emphatically not aristocrats. The social logic of knighthood depended entirely on the knight being qualitatively different from everyone else on the battlefield, capable of things that ordinary men simply could not do. The longbow was beginning to dismantle that logic. The gun would finish the job. Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453, and that story deserves its own video. But one detail belongs here. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II brought a Hungarian engineer named Urban to cast him a cannon so large it required 60 oxen to move and a crew of several hundred men to operate. It could fire a stone ball weighing 600 pounds. The walls of Constantinople had stood for over 1,000 years. They had survived Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, and multiple serious attempts to take the city by storm. They were widely considered the most formidable urban fortifications in the world. Urban's cannon reduced sections of those walls to rubble in weeks. The city fell, ending the Byzantine Empire, and symbolically, the last direct institutional link to ancient Rome. The lesson every European monarch took from Constantinople was identical. Walls don't protect you anymore. The only thing that protects you now is having better guns than your enemy, and better guns cost money. Enormous, ongoing, escalating amounts of money. Armies built around expensive knights who served in exchange for land grants couldn't fund the new military technology. What was needed was tax revenue, professional soldiers, and centralized procurement. The military economy of Europe was about to be restructured from the ground up, and the political entities that couldn't make that transition weren't going to survive the process. Here is the part that history textbooks usually skip. The knight didn't die because guns made armor useless overnight. Armor actually kept improving well into the 16th century. The full-plate armor of the 1500s was genuinely capable of stopping early firearms at most combat ranges, and armorsmiths developed proof marks stamped on breastplates to certify they had been tested against specific powder charges at specific distances. Some of the finest armor ever made was produced in the decades after guns became widespread. The knights at the Battle of Pavia in 1525 wore better armor than the knights at Agincourt had. It didn't matter. The knight died because of money, not because of metallurgy. A trained knight in 1400 represented an investment of roughly 20 years of education and physical training. The full suit of plate armor cost as much as a small farm. 2 or 3 war horses, each trained specifically for combat, and therefore worth far more than an ordinary horse. Weapons, a squire to help with the equipment, ongoing maintenance costs for armor that needed constant repair after any serious use. The total annual cost of maintaining a single knight in the field ran to figures that represented years of income for ordinary families. And what did you get for that investment? One man. One very dangerous, very skilled, very heavily armed man, but still one man. A trained arquebusier in 1500 required approximately 6 weeks of instruction. The weapon cost roughly as much as a good horse. Powder and shot were cheap enough to purchase in bulk. You could equip and train 20 arquebusiers for what one knight cost annually, and the 20 men with guns could kill the knight before he got close enough to use his sword. The treasurer who did that arithmetic didn't need to be a military genius. He just needed to be able to count. The Swiss pikemen had demonstrated the underlying principle before guns made it definitive. At Morgarten in 1315, Swiss peasants ambushed a column of Austrian knights in a mountain pass, rolling boulders down on them and then attacking with halberds while the knights struggled to maneuver on the narrow trail. At Laupen in 1339, Swiss infantry held off charges by Burgundian cavalry through discipline and pike formation. At Grandson and Merton in 1476, Swiss pike squares destroyed the army of Charles the Bold of Burgundy, the wealthiest and best-equipped ruler in Europe, who had spent enormous sums trying to build the perfect chivalric army. At Nancy in 1477, Charles himself was killed. His body was found on the battlefield 3 days later, stripped of its expensive armor by soldiers who had more practical uses for the metal. The last serious attempt to make heavy cavalry the decisive arm of European warfare died face down in the mud with him. What replaced the knight was the professional soldier, not a man with personal loyalty to a specific lord, earning his position through hereditary status and years of expensive training. A paid soldier recruited by the state, trained in standardized weapons, equipped from central armories, and commanded by officers who answered to a king or a council rather than to their own personal honor code. The Spanish tercio of the early 16th century combined pikemen and arquebusiers in mutually supporting formations that could defend against cavalry and destroy enemy infantry simultaneously. It had no use for individual knightly glory. It needed men who could hold formation under fire, reload in sequence, and follow orders from a commander they might never have met before that morning. The individual didn't matter. The unit did. The feudal contract was simple in theory. A lord provided military protection, the kind that came from expensive training and equipment that peasants couldn't afford. In return, peasants provided labor, crops, and taxes. The knight's elevated social position was justified entirely by his military function. He was expensive to maintain because he was militarily necessary. He held land because the king needed his military service. He had legal privileges because those privileges were the price of his service. Remove the military necessity, and you remove the justification for everything built on top of it. Gunpowder removed the military necessity across a period of roughly a century and a half. By the mid-16th century, a conscripted peasant with 6 weeks of training and a matchlock musket could kill any knight in Europe. Not in a fair fight, not in a joust, not in single combat where the knight's skill and strength still meant everything. On a battlefield, at range, before the knight got close enough to matter. The military superiority that had justified aristocratic privilege for 1,000 years was gone. What remained was the privilege without the justification, the taxes, the legal immunities, the monopoly on political power, now maintained purely by tradition and by the violence of the centralized state that the aristocracy still largely controlled. The peasants noticed. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 was the largest mass uprising in European history before the French Revolution. Over 300,000 peasants took up arms across a territory stretching from Switzerland to Saxony. Their grievances went back generations: excessive taxation, loss of common land rights, the legal disabilities of serfdom, the steady erosion of traditional community privileges by landlords who saw the new economic environment as an opportunity to extract more from the people who worked their land. But they also had something new. They had guns. The tools of violence had become cheap enough that large numbers of common people could acquire them. The monopoly on organized force that had underpinned aristocratic society for centuries was weakening. The war failed. Professional armies under the command of German princes crushed the peasant forces at multiple engagements, killing somewhere between 100,000 and 130,000 people in the suppression. The surviving peasants returned to their villages in worse legal condition than before, their lords having used the rebellion as justification for tightening serfdom rather than loosening it. But the uprising demonstrated something that every European ruler filed away carefully. When weapons became cheap, the people at the bottom of society became dangerous in ways they had never quite been before. Keeping them disarmed, or at least outgunned, became a political priority rather than just a practical preference. The English Civil War, fought between 1642 and 1651, produced one of history's more instructive symbolic moments on this theme. Prince Rupert of the Rhine was a superb cavalry commander, trained in the old tradition of aggressive, fast-moving horse. He repeatedly won the opening phase of battles by doing exactly what cavalry was supposed to do: charging hard, breaking enemy formations, pursuing the fleeing troops with everything he had. He was brave, skilled, and tactically brilliant within the framework he had been trained in. He lost the war anyway, because his cavalry, scattered across miles of countryside in pursuit of broken enemies, couldn't reform and return in time to effect the battle's final outcome. Oliver Cromwell's Ironsides trained specifically to halt after a charge, reform under fire, and charge again at a different target. Discipline beat glory every time. The new model army that won the English Civil War and eventually put a king on trial was not a feudal host. It was a professional organization built on pay, training, and institutional loyalty to a cause rather than personal loyalty to a lord. The last armored knights disappeared from European battlefields around 1700. Heavy cavalry, soldiers wearing breastplates and carrying sabers, survived into the Napoleonic era and beyond. But the knight as a social institution, as a military class whose existence and privilege were justified by an irreplaceable military function, was finished long before the last cuirassier hung up his armor. The armor came off gradually. The social privileges took longer. The French nobility retained its legal exemptions from taxation until the night of August 4th, 1789, when the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges in a session that lasted until 2 in the morning, nobles rising one after another to renounce rights their families had held for centuries. The guillotine handled the ones who changed their minds afterward. There is a direct line from the cannon at Crécy to the blade falling on Louis XVI's neck in January 1793. Not a straight line, not a simple line, but a real one. Once gunpowder made the knight's military function obsolete, the question of why the aristocracy deserved its privileges became genuinely difficult to answer. It took 3.5 centuries for that question to produce a French Revolution. But the question was always there, becoming more insistent with every decade that passed, waiting for the moment when enough people decided the answer was that they didn't. Kings understood the dynamic earlier than nobles did, which is why the early modern period saw such dramatic centralization of royal power at the expense of the aristocracy. A king who could field a professional army paid from tax revenue didn't need to negotiate with fractious lords who owned their own castles and their own military retinues. He needed tax collectors and a treasury. He needed professional officers who answered to his chain of command rather than to their own honor code. He needed the kind of administrative machinery that could recruit, equip, and supply tens of thousands of men rather than call up hundreds of knights for a season's campaigning. The new military technology created both the need and the opportunity for the centralized nation-state, and European monarchs seized that opportunity with remarkable speed. What the Chinese alchemists, searching for immortality in the 9th century, could not possibly have imagined is that their failed experiment would, 7 centuries later, restructure European society from the bottom up. They weren't trying to change anything. They were trying to live forever. They found something that killed instead, not just individual people, but an entire class, an entire way of organizing political and social life around the proposition that the man who could afford the best armor and the best horse deserved to rule everyone who couldn't. Now you know about the gunpowder paradox. Thank you so much for watching. I will be glad to meet you in a new video. And of course, subscribe to my channel. It's interesting here.